All right, Tihani Washte, Haumatakiape, Wambli Watakpe, and Ichiape. My name is Sean Sherman. Just kind of getting thrown into this a little bit. So they want me to read you a big story about the creation of NAFSA this morning. And then we'll do some introductions. And we'll have some questions for you guys. And then we'll, if we have time, there might be a little bit of Q&A that will come through the online thing. So we'll just go from there. But, thank you everybody for coming to the panel. This is the Indigenous Food Sovereignty and Seed Rematriation, featuring members of the Indigenous Seedkeepers Network, a program of the Native American Food Sovereignty Alliance. So for a little bit of context, the Native American Food Sovereignty Alliance, or NAFSA, is a 501c3 organization dedicated to restoring the food systems that support Indigenous self-determination, wellness, cultures, values, communities, economies, languages, and families while rebuilding relationships with the land, water, plants, and animals that sustain us. The intention is to accomplish this by putting the farmers, wildcrafters, fishers, hunters, ranchers, and eaters at the center of decision-making on policies and strategies and management. NAFSA was created to bring grassroots practitioners, communities, both rural, remote, and urban, and organizations together, along with tribal governments, to share, promote, and support best practices and policies that enhance dynamic native food systems. The idea of NAFSA was first incubated through a grant from the Oxfam America to the Taos County Economic Development Corporation in 2005, which made it possible to bring together grassroots Native American food activists to brainstorm how to best support the broader food sovereignty movement, as well as individual projects and producers. In 2012, the First Nations Development Institute re-granted the Kellogg Foundation funds under its Native Agriculture and Food Systems Initiative, which gave NAFSA the resources to get more organized and begin recruiting interested members. The NAFSA Founding Council comprised of members representing Native farmers, food producers, policy advocates, fisher people, herders, and community advocates, and they all met for the first time in October 2013. And have met annually since then to update the strategic plan and to review progress and processes. NAFSA officially incorporated as a 501c3 not-for-profit in 2013 and with the Navajo Nation in 2014. In 2013, NAFSA established the priority program areas to be resource development, policy, advocacy, education, health, through cooking, peer-to-peer mentoring, youth engagement, and reestablishing of Indigenous trade routes. NAFSA's strategic plan was refined in October 2016 to include providing assistance and peer mentoring through several means, including training programs, train the trainer, curriculum for long-distance learning, publications and videos highlighting tribal communities' success stories of food sovereignty systems. NAFSA currently houses two main programs, the Native Food and Culinary Mentorship Program and the Indigenous Seedkeepers Network, or ISKN, whose work we are here today to share with you. ISKN works to provide educational resources, mentorship training, outreach, and advocacy support on seed policy issues and organizes national and regional events and convening to connect communities who are engaging in work around rematriating and preserving native seeds. Through a train-the-trainer peer mentorship model that shapes workshops that Rowan White, Shiloh Maples, and ISKN staff and volunteers have designed and hosted, dozens of gatherings have been offered around the country seeking to reinstate seed knowledge and create leaders who can then educate members of their own communities. The goal is not only growing good seed, but also the next generation of seed stewards. In the process, creating a network in which to best share practices and inspiration. ISKN recently developed a Seed Sovereignty Assessment Toolkit, which helps communities assess the availability of adequate quality seeds and promotes strategic thinking about the recovery, development, as well as culturally appropriate use of seeds. The assessment is designed to help communities to think about specific seed security problems they might face, and then steers response to the actions that will assist in improving access and developing healthy systems. The ultimate goal of the Seed Sovereignty Assessment Toolkit is to help Native communities reclaim local and traditional seed systems, starting with a culturally relevant community seed project and develop a resilient seed stewardship mentorship network. In the end, the hope is that all these emerging seed keepers and agricultural leaders will be able to engage in their communities in conversation and action around food and seed literacy. On our panel today, we have two Native seed keepers who have worked in various capacities for ISKN to tell us more about the work that this this organization is carrying out, how they are working to connect seed keepers across Indian country and also working to support the rematriation of seeds back to their home communities. So I did I tried to memorize that, but that didn't quite work out. So, but anyways, I'm going to introduce Shiloh, and I'll just let you give yourself the introduction.
Thank you, Sean.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us this morning on such short notice.
It's all right. I love getting up early.
As said, my name is Shiloh Maples. I'm Ojibwe and Odawa, and I live in Southeast Michigan. And I guess I'm the program manager currently at Native American Food Sovereignty Alliance. I just briefly, I guess I'll share how I got into seed keeping. Over 10 years or so ago, I was starting my career working at the Native Urban Health Clinic in Detroit. And I had an opportunity to work in partnership with the community to start a food program at our site. And I spent the first 6 or 8 months surveying community members and having listening sessions and town halls to really better understand the priorities of our community and what they thought was the best way forward. And part of what I learned was the foods that people wanted access to no longer existed in our community. And so I sent out a handful of letters to the Native food programs around the country that I knew about at the time, which were just a few because I wasn't connected to the larger network yet, and let them know what we were trying to do and that I wanted to start a seed library, and told them that I would do my best to take care of them and to pass on their stories to our community members. And it wasn't long, within a couple weeks, packages started coming in with letters of their communities of origin or their origin stories. And I was so moved. My coworkers at the time could tell you I would just, like, in a really good way, be really like overwhelmed to tears that folks had entrusted us with something so sacred to them. And so I took that promise very, very seriously and did everything I could to learn how to be a good seed steward and to pass that knowledge on to others in our community. And I guess kind of the rest is history after that. It kind of changed the trajectory of my work from there. And then in 2020, I joined NAFSA.
Great. Awesome. Thank you. And Aaron, I'll let you do your introduction, and then we'll go with some questions.
Awesome. Thank you. Kawatsi hopa, kaita hopa ti trash wakaitse, watosh na me koi, este koi hanusta, ayako coachinish washta, Aaron Lowden Medican, she este. Good morning, everybody. Hope everybody's doing well today. My name is Aaron Lowden from Acoma, Pueblo. You can also call me Koi. I am Bear Clan and Yellowcorn Clan from Acoma, Pueblo. And it's great to be here today to meet everybody. And it's been a long time since I've been in a crowd this big, so it's really nice to see everybody today. And it's good to be in person with people again today. Just a little bit myself real quickly. Prior to working with NAFSA, I was working with an organization called Ancestral Lands. Back in 2010, December is when I first started, and I was an intern and worked my way to staff over the next 2 years. My predecessor is the one that started the program, but kind of took it off from there after he exited the program. And one of the programs that we had initiated when we first started was a program called Farm Corps. And so from there, it was just mostly when it started out, it was just getting young people outdoors and getting them farming and doing those things. And because we saw such a decrease of farmers in my community of Acoma, which was pretty interesting to see, because in the past 50 years, there's probably most of the families were subsistence farmers. Very few people were not farming, and so either that or raising livestock, sheep and cattle, or hunters and gatherers still. And so that all changed over the past 100 years, and it's very different from when my mother grew up, who was like one of those subsistence farmers, and my uncles and families and relatives. And so we tried to address that through that program, and we worked with young people, middle school, high school students mostly, throughout those years, first 10 years of the program. And over the course of those years, we kind of sort of organically grew into a whole food systems revitalization program. And from there on, we developed we just realized we got to save seed every year from our stock, and so we can grow again next year. And so we just kept building and building, and now we house up to 57 local varieties of different heirloom seeds, indigenous seeds. And so that built up quite a bit, and now we're sort of a resource for the community. And we also dabbled in seed rematriation. So we had some seed that haven't been in existence in their communities for the past, I'd say, 20 years or so. And there was around 1987, 1986, where there were seeds collected from the community by a seed bank, and we found out that they were selling these seed and giving away these seed, and without really any of the tribe's consent. So we kindly asked for the seeds back, and they were returned. And so we had several different seeds and several different successions of those seed, and we were able to return. Just this past year, actually just this past month, we grew out them the past 2 years and returned them to the community to the families of origin, and those families were reunited with their seeds too. And so that's can definitely relate to what Shiloh was saying. And so yeah, we raised a bunch of young people. I left the program last year, or end of last year. Left my successors in charge. Two of them, her name is Zeta and Zarek. So they were folks that I've been working with since one was 12 and one was 14. And so we pretty much raised them. They're like 25 and 23 right now. So left them in charge of the program and came into NAFSA and been working with NAFSA since January of this year. And was really excited to continue the work, but on the broader spectrum of and helping people and aiding people and doing what we were doing in Acoma, but on the broader way. So now we're here.
Awesome. All right, so I've got a question for both of you guys. So I've got a few set questions, and then we're going to kind of see where it goes from there. But just to explain to everybody, and especially people who are just getting into seed keeping and learning about open pollinated seeds, organic seeds, hybrid seeds, native indigenous seeds, how do you and the communities that you work with decide what qualifies as a native seed versus just another open pollinated or heirloom seed?
Well, I think that everyone has their own definition or way of thinking about that. And I don't want to speak for any of the communities we work with, but for myself, we all have our own kinship systems and ways of thinking about belonging. And I just see our seed relatives as part of that. So for me, my native or indigenous seeds are relatives that have been part of our community for as long as we know, and have been on the shared landmass with our community and have a shared history. And so that's kind of the way that I think about it.
Sure.
Yeah, so pretty similar to what Shiloh said. And the first thing that I was taught when I started farming with my uncles and my mother, who all grew up like that, is that, my uncle, I remember the first year that we planted, he planted with me alongside, just less than like 10 feet away from me in one of our family fields. And I had planted, watered, irrigated the first time. Been 2 weeks since I had been down there, and I get a little knock at my door, and he asked me, "Where you been?" And I was like, "Oh, I'm just this and that, I was like, "Okay, well, you haven't been down at the field, that's for sure." And so I was like, "I've been down there every day," he would say. And then he got after me and said, "That's not something you do. And he explained to me what it meant to have seed and caretake a field. And he said, "Those are your kids. In our way, that's how we think about it. Those are your children. And so when you put that seed in the ground, you're taking responsibility for another life, and that's a living, breathing thing, and you take care of it like that." And so that's what I always thought of, and just that piece of knowledge and little piece of advice really changed my whole perspective of informed, and even the way I live my life, and the way that, to caretake and take responsibility for things. And those teachings like that and that kind of love and the take care and attention are something that I feel like that's what, when you work with some of our seeds from our communities of origin. And so the seeds that have been passed down from generation to generation, that have been cared and guided, slaved and selected over generations, different colors, tastes, and textures, adapted to our different bioregions, our microbioregions. Like in New Mexico, we have such a varied lands, elevations, topographies, ranges all the way from range and basin plains to very mountainous areas, plateaus. And Acoma is one of the oldest continuously inhabited communities in North America. We always compete that title with like Taos and Odawa and Hopi. So, but I always just say one of the, because I don't want to compete with anybody. Anyways, we've lived on the Colorado Plateau area for centuries. Even prior to that, in our migration stories, we came from areas like Chaco Canyon and Mesa Verde. In our stories, it's where we say we came from. When you think about the histories think of how many times they had to move and settle and migrate and carry those seeds with them and adapt them to those different places and guide and protect them. Even like in Chaco Canyon, reading about how there was no perennial water source there. It was no springs, no river systems there, other than like a few arroyos that would flow during the rainy season. So they were capturing and harvesting water every way they could, and also importing corn from different areas as well. And so I would just think of constantly of like the legacy of those, and some of the close legacy of like, say my uncle, he always had me take care of the squash that it's known from our Pueblo, and one of my other uncles, a melon that was from our Pueblo, and I just think, wow, I just think of the generations that had to save and select to get the seed to this point to look like this and taste like this. And so for me, the seeds are just like, indigenous seeds are grown within not only like have that genetics, but that cultural context of being grown in ceremony, grown with love and care and attention like a family member.
So that connection.
Yeah.
So Shiloh, could you explain in your own way and define rematriation for people that might not be familiar with that term? Because I think it's an important one for when we're talking about indigenous seed keeping and all the pieces, and why does this term keep popping up, and why are we using that term?
Yeah, so I think most folks are more familiar with a term akin to that of repatriation, which is both a legal and political process of returning culturally significant items back to their communities of origin. And in a similar way, rematriation is also about, in this situation, seed rematriation is reconnecting communities with their seed relatives. And it's a legal, political, spiritual, it's a very intensive process of reconnecting people and their seeds. And I think the emphasis on the feminine, at least from what I've been taught, kind of stems from that in many indigenous communities, at least in North America, that caretaking for the seeds is part of the women's bundle of responsibilities. And so women traditionally in a lot of communities have been the ones that are keeping the seed, are the ones that, not to say that men haven't or aren't involved, they definitely are, but women are the ones that are really like going through the seed and deciding which ones go into the pot and which ones are going to be saved for the next year, and doing that selection from generation to the next generation about what certain qualities, as Aaron was saying, like you're going to steward and take care of. But something Aaron and I have been talking about a lot recently is this term of rematriation. In the scope of things, it's probably a newer term. It's probably the one that's most used to describe this work right now, but we've also been asking ourselves if it's the most appropriate term for everyone to use, because there's probably terms in many of our communities and our languages that are similar and have very nuanced layers to it that rematriation may not. So, while we're talking about like this general body of work or way of doing things, we also, I guess, recognize that the terminology or language might be very different for some. I know it was directed towards me, but any thoughts, Aaron?
No, that was perfect. Yeah, that's great. Yeah.
Yeah, and I guess the question I would have for you, Aaron, was what are Indigenous Seedkeepers Network's plans for helping communities and institutions navigate best practices of seed rematriation?
So I came in at beginning of January this year, and a lot of the work that I'm carrying on right now is thanks to people like folks like Shiloh, but also I think a lot of people are familiar with Rowan White and her work, and it's just fantastic, and does a lot of amazing things with seed, and has been leading a lot of these movements, and so it's really carrying on a lot of like what she had initiated, and like for one, the seed sovereignty toolkit that they developed, and also the we're going to be releasing and putting on our website our seed sovereignty or seed rematriation toolkit, and so there will have like just different case studies of how communities have initiated seed rematriation in their communities and the process they went upon that, and just telling the stories of the work they've done to bring the seed back into the community, return the seeds, and return those foods to the communities of origin. And then on the horizon, we're looking at initiating also some campaigns around seed returns. One thing we're playing around with ideas like hashtag seed back, in the same way that we're calling for the return of land to the communities. We're also wanting to call upon the different collectors, seed banks, institutions that have that access to those seeds that our communities a lot of times don't. A lot of times those seeds have been missing totally from the community for decades, just like some of the seeds that we were able to bring back and return to our community in Acoma. That was a long process, but it was a unique process too in that. And so I'm sure there's a lot of great stories of how that was done and how that was initiated. And so that's essentially what we're planning on doing right now is do those different avenues of looking at and giving people examples and helping potentially guide that process as well.
And I guess just one quickly to add, like Aaron and I have also been hosting virtual listening sessions with growers and community-based groups to really learn what their priorities are and what tools and resources would be most useful to them. So even after those listening sessions wrap up, if folks ever want to get in touch with us and let us know, like we're all ears and want to hear what would be beneficial to you in that work.
Yeah, because I sit on the board with Seed Savers Exchange and have been there for quite a while Rowan had just stepped down this last year, but there was she had put in so much good work like digging through all those archives, and I think she identified like 130 varietals, and for a couple of years they were growing out like 25 of those to do that rematriation project back then. And I know there's just a lot of seeds still out there, because I've also seen in museum holdings where they've just held so many seeds that eventually turn into literal archives, because they're like 100 years old when they should have been shared back into the communities. So it's really trying to figure out ways to not let that happen, because we need to keep Indigenous seeds in Indigenous hands, especially. Off topic on some of these questions, just out of curiosity, like how do you guys look at native seeds for native communities versus ally farmers who are just wanting to keep some of these things alive? And where do you find, like, what are your positions on non-native people growing some of these native seeds?
I ultimately look to the community about what they think is proper protocol for their seeds, and it varies. I think we've been having a lot of conversations, at least in the Upper Midwest Seedkeepers network, about like what are our intertribal protocols for exchanging seed with each other, and then also with non-Indigenous growers. And like I said, there are a lot of different perspectives about that, and I don't know if I necessarily have a super strong stance myself. Like there are pros and cons to things, and it really depends on the relationship with the grower, I think. I have some really great allies with some rematriation project at University of Michigan that have been helping grow out seeds that have been kept in their collection, and they've been incredible allies. But I also like really want to honor and respect like each community and family's autonomy to make that decision about related to their seeds.
Yeah, definitely echo that part about the autonomy and just depending on what the community wants and what they prefer to, how they prefer to do it. And just in some instances, for example, some folks don't have the land base or water access and things like that. And if they need areas outside of the, maybe tribal lands, tribal waters that to grow out that seed, then I for sure see that being, a time to do that. But for myself, I think the ultimate end goal is definitely, to have the seeds grown in the lands they were cultivated in for centuries and the waters they were cultivated in, climate as well. And so I think that's, at least for the work that I've been doing, that's always been my end goal, is to have the seeds come here. But also recognizing that, historically we've always shared seed. There's always been these intricate, like cross-country, cross-coast seed sharing that's been happening. And I've ran into folks that have had Acoma, other indigenous folks that have Acoma seed, and just, clear across the country. I'm like, wow, how'd you get access to the seed a long time ago, and our family traded, whatever, this back here, went way back when in the 80s, 70s. And so, and some of those folks were kind enough to return some of those seeds, a lot of them, which we haven't seen in the community for some time. And so I think it just depends, but also, yeah, I think that it's really the ultimate end goal is to have those seeds back in their home soils, homelands, and home waters and home climate.
Something Aaron just said made me think too, is like, often considering in discussion with allies or folks that want to be allies about how they can share their power, their wealth and resources, or to really shift that power so that we don't have to rely on them to grow out our seed for us. That's a question I always, I guess, pose to groups is like, what are you really doing to like change the current situation? So, to really support food and seed sovereignty of our communities rather than systems of dependency.
Right. And another question that I just have, just from my perspective, is just curious about commercialization of some of the indigenous seed pieces, because obviously as indigenous seed growers, you guys have very deep connections to a lot of these seeds, and you're very protective, you're very loving, to these entities, that we bring into life every single year again, right? And, as a chef, especially running a Native American restaurant where we try to feature as much indigenous product from indigenous peoples as much as possible, local first, then national, and we're able to purchase a lot of wonderful product, And so for myself, it's probably a little bit different because we could really feature something, we can tell that story. But how do you guys go about thinking like growing these crops out enough? Like, is it for just the community? Is it for people to be able to make a living so they can sell these at farmers markets or to restaurants? And just what is your position on kind of, as we are able to grow out more of these seeds and keep them out there, like where do we draw a line between capitalization, commercialization, and also just the representation of indigenous peoples and our relationship to these seeds?
Mm-hmm. Do you want to go first?
Oh yeah, for sure. I think ultimately for myself, at least is my kind of personal opinion, that I really strongly avoid the commodification of those seed, because that's one thing that we voiced as a sort of a harmful practice with the certain seed bank that was selling and marketing our seed for I don't know how many years, but it was something that I feel like ties into larger, structural, systemic things of like capitalism that have been kind of pushed upon our communities, that have been, pushed to commodify these relatives of ours. And, I wouldn't sell a relative, so it's kind of hard for me to do that. But, I think about this a lot, actually, especially it looks different for every community. I use some examples of just like the eastern and western Pueblos in New Mexico. The eastern Pueblos are situated along the Rio Grande, and they're situated towards more like urban communities and urban areas. Urban areas. And so when you go more west, we're more rural. You hit Laguna, Acoma, Zuni, Hopi. And so we're very rural in those areas. And, I feel like because that we haven't been situated in near any large urban areas, that, you know, a lot of us are still just sharing and not really selling anything. And so it's just like there's not really the opportunities for markets to sell those things. And so, you know, what we see in my area is just that if you have seed, you have crops, then you just share it out with your relatives in your community and call upon the aunties and uncles and relatives to come on in and start husking corn and you know, and storing it away and all those things and giving it away to the family. And then, you know, it's just something we use for ceremonial and also traditional purposes. And then if you have a bumper crop of like melons or, you know, pumpkins or watermelons, then you set up shop at a little crossroads and say, oh, here's $2 for a melon, you know, or whatever it is. And so, and I feel like it's transformed a little bit when you process it. You know, like corn, for example, when you grind it down, you know, it's that value added, and you're actually transforming it into, you know, a food. Whenever you cook it, you're transforming it into a food. And so, I think it's a little bit different. You know, it's not exactly selling the seed, and so it's selling, you know, from that point, you're transforming it into food and selling it as food. So I feel like at least that's the distinction I make, you know, in my head.
Yeah, I think similar for me, like on a personal level, I don't sell any of the seed that I grow. I don't like the thought of commodifying seed because they're my relatives. But I also recognize like the reality that we live in, that like people need money to survive in this world. And so, you know, ultimately in the work, like if communities want to make a value-added product or do different things, like our goal is to look, or our priority is to look to communities and say, how can we support you in your work? I think at the same time that there's a opportunity or invitation for us to really look at alternative or different economic systems, revitalizing traditional trade, and imagine, you know, what opportunities or other ways of doing business could exist, that we can step out of the current economic system and build something different. I don't know exactly what that looks like yet, but I'm enjoying having conversations like this,
sure.
of exploring
it.
it.
Yeah. All right, so we only have 30 seconds left, but I want you guys just to say, what's your favorite seed right now?
Like being asked who's your favorite child.
Totally.
And very publicly, like answering that.
I won't tell the other seeds.
For myself, I would say an Odawa bean. It's one of my ancestral foods, but I feel like when we were reunited with each other, like a lot of things in my life changed, like, and a whole new path was opened up to me. I always say that the seeds have a very magical and mysterious way about them, and finding you once you kind of like put that intention out there. And so I feel a very special relationship to that particular bean.
Oh man, I was I kept going literally back and forth, but I think between the Acoma blue corn that was recently returned and also this heirloom squash we have, so I'll go and get the heirloom squash, but it's a really beautiful squash that was given to me by my uncle back in 2014. We tried growing it for 3 years, and he gave me just a little butter container full of seed that was sitting in his garage for a long time, and that was seed that everybody in the community was asking for. Do you have it? We call it Titi Shukotani, so like the north side pumpkin, and it's this really beautiful squash that grows oblong, and it's the old folks nickname it banana squash, and it's this buttery sweet pumpkin that, you know, that everybody goes after when it's roasted and roasted in their ovens, and it's just such a sweet treat and dessert. And so it's pretty even sweeter than like butternut squash that I've tasted. It's just like you don't even need any kind of any sweetener in there. I just pour it in when I'm making a puree or soup or something like that, and it's awesome. And I think that it's, for myself, it's like my connection to my uncle. He passed away from complications due to diabetes, and about 4 years ago now. And so for myself, that's, you know, we always talk about like the legacies of our ancestors, this collective inheritance. But for myself, that's his legacy, that, you know, it's the last piece of physical thing that I can hold on to and grow and keep growing, and that's a piece of him that keeps living on and on every time I get to grow that seed. So I always grow it in memory of Stanawa Yaainia, that was his name, Yaainia. And so I always think of him every time I grow that and pray to him to ask me to continue to grow that seed and share it. And I think he'd be really happy to know that we share it with so many people now. That's something that came from him. So he was a big farmer, and I really, really think about him. And so that's, for myself, that's why I cherish that seed so much. Yeah.
All right, well, thank you guys so much. Your work is so important. Thank you for sharing your thoughts, and thank you guys for listening.